right. Welcome, everyone. We are excited to have you here today to talk more about the Inflation Reduction Act. We really appreciate you joining us on a Friday afternoon, especially at a weird time for us East Coasters. We were trying to get our West Coast people, give them an actual reasonable webinar time this time. So thank you all for joining us at the end of your day or at lunchtime. We're going to give it just a minute so everybody who's in the waiting room can hop on, and then we'll get started. Feel free to drop in the chat where you're coming in from. If you're a solar owner, what your interest is in the Inflation Reduction Act, feel free to drop that in the chat. And we will be answering lots and lots of questions. We have a short presentation, and we'll be answering questions as well. And we are going to record this. We'll send out the recording as well as any of the resources that we mentioned and some of our FAQs afterwards. So don't feel like you have to take notes. We'll give you everything that you absolutely need. Awesome. So numbers are still going up. Give it one more second. Yay, good. Arizona. I'm glad we've got some West Coast people. That was the whole point. Awesome. All right. Well, we will get started. And again, we are recording. So if you missed the very beginning, you will be able to get those slides later. So welcome. This is our opportunity to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act. We really appreciate you joining us this afternoon. We have plenty of time for questions. So if you've had questions that are burning, then you will be able to answer or ask those. So just a couple of logistics before we get started. We welcome questions. We love questions, but we do ask that you put your questions into the Q&A. So if you hover over the bottom of your screen, you can see the boxes that are chat as well as Q&A. And it's easiest if you ask your questions in the Q&A. Feel free to talk to other participants, the panelists, anything like that. Feel free to use the chat for that. But if you have an official question, please use the Q&A and we'll be using that. And if you want everyone to see your chat, so if you're just talking with everybody and you want to make a comment, make sure that that bottom bar says everyone. Otherwise, you might just send it to a certain person or host and panelists. So I know we're all Zoom experts at this point, but it's always worth a reminder. All right. And we have way too many people to have anybody unmute themselves this time. So I see some raised hands. Unfortunately, you're going to have to put your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A. But again, it's a great problem to have. So we are joined today by a great team that covers our advocacy and also our Go Solar programs. So Glenn Brand, our VP of Policy and Advocacy, Emma Searson, our Policy and Advocacy campaigner, and Corey Ramsden, our VP of Go Solar. Glenn, I'll hand it over to you. Oh, you're muted, Glenn.
You'd think I would learn, but I've got it now. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Glenn Brand, and I serve as the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for Solar United Neighbors. And I really want to thank you for taking the time to join us to learn more about the consumer solar and energy efficiency opportunities in the recently enacted Inflation Reduction Act, or as we'll refer to it from now on, the IRA. Before we review the clean energy highlights of the law, and this is again from a consumer perspective, not from a solar industry perspective, I do want to talk briefly about the larger context of the bill. First, I think it's worth noting that the IRA is the most significant U.S. climate and clean energy policy ever enacted. It appropriates a total of $369 billion for energy and climate initiatives. That's B with a billion. Analysts estimate it will help the U.S. reduce global warming emissions by about 40% compared to 2005 levels by the end of the decade. That is this decade. And this puts the U.S. back more or less on track to meet the Paris climate agreement commitments. That's a very large context. I think the second thing I'd like to mention is that the IRA takes a different approach to clean energy policy than the previous efforts. And I think the best way to sum that up is that the strategy is building a national industrial policy centered around clean energy economy. You know, that what I mean by that is it aims to develop both the supply and demand sides. On the supply side, Um, it's trying to create a domestic clean energy manufacturing and supply chain. And then on the demand side, uh, we have all of the incentives and rebates and loans that we'll be talking about. And that's, of course, an effort to create greater demand for clean energy products and services and start that industrial cycle. I think another thing that's worth observing is that it contains a lot of carrots, right? We're talking about rebates and incentives, and very few sticks. And the purpose, of course, is to scale the deployment of clean energy technology, so massive scale, which is, of course, what we all like to see. I think the key takeaway for consumers is that the IRA will make it more affordable for individuals, for businesses, municipalities, rural electric cooperatives, nonprofits that would like to go solar and electrify. It's going to make it much more accessible for these entities and others to go solar, as we say in short. The next slide, please. And then these are the things I said before. And so let's skip to the next slide. Sorry about that. I got behind. I just want to touch on some of the concrete benefits, or at least the estimates of those. The White House projects that the IRA will save the average family who takes advantage of the available incentives, of course, over $1,000 each year. So that's a lot of money over time. I saw a separate analysis done by Rewiring America that estimates that families could save about $1,800 each year with electric heat pump for their HVAC and hot water and electric vehicle and solar panels. And so the full package would result in good savings. It's estimated the bill will enable 7.5 million families to install solar on their properties. And of course, that requires lots of jobs to do this work. So that's a good thing. More solar, of course, means reduced fossil fuel production. And it's projected that the IRA will prevent 3,900 premature deaths and up to 100,000 asthma attacks annually by 2030. And as you'll hear more about a little later when Emma presents, the IRA dedicates billions of dollars towards programs that will address some of the inequities in our energy system. So that's way overdue. The law, of course, is not perfect and falls short of many important goals. One concern that a lot of people have expressed and that we share is that as a result of a compromise with Senator Manchin from West Virginia, the IRA includes provisions that do promote fossil fuel production and use, and that is something that needs to be addressed. But I think we're confident that the IRA is still a very big step forward. And Solar United Neighbors in particular is proud to have helped shape the bill through our 30 Million Solar Homes federal policy campaign. And if you're familiar with it, the goal of that campaign was to enact policies that would result in 1 in 4 American households going solar. And that would be about 30 million, thus the name of the campaign. And we estimate that the IRA will get us close to a third of that ambitious goal. I also want to take the opportunity to thank everyone who sent messages over the last 18 months, 2 years to their elected officials in support of the pro-solar parts of the bill and really helped make this happen. And with that, I am glad to turn it over to my colleague, Corey Ramson, who is, again, the Vice President of Solar United Neighbors Go Solar Department. Corey?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate it. I have a couple slides here. I'm going to talk through some of the details around the solar rebate. And if you could go ahead 1 slide for me. But one of the things, just kind of to set the stage here, one of the things I love most about this work is really learning new things and then applying that to our work to expand solar adoption throughout the country. And so you can imagine how exciting it's been to digest all of this information over the last couple of weeks. That said, there's lots of things we still don't know. What we're sharing here today is what we know already, and we hope you'll stay tuned with us and our work as the full details and impact of this legislation become clear in the months and years ahead. There's a lot we still don't know, and it's going to be some exciting times. If you could go to the next slide, Penny. So first off, talking just a little bit about the investment tax credit. As most of you are probably aware, there's already a federal tax credit that is a percentage off the installed system cost that you get back on your taxes. That is for homeowners, still non-refundable. That's one of the things that we had hoped to see included in the bill that was not, is having some option for folks perhaps who don't have a lot of tax liability to receive some sort of direct pay for putting solar on their roof. And that is not, unfortunately, in the bill, but there are other direct pay options that I'll talk about in a minute. Top line, though, is that the legislation restores that tax credit to 30%. Starting in 2022. So for systems that are going to be placed in service this year, that tax credit will be 30%, and it goes all the way to 2032. So 10 years at that level, which is a great level of certainty for the industry and for homeowners who are thinking about putting solar on their rooftop, in addition to all the commercial stuff that we'll talk about as well. 2033, it steps down to 26%, and then in 2034 to 22%. So that's a pretty significant component to the bill, and it's just expanding a policy or restating a policy and having it be in place for a long period of time. That's already proven to demonstrate and really drive the solar industry's growth over the last decade plus. One of the things that is in the bill about helping to expand access, which is new, is that there is direct pay for tax-exempt entities like nonprofits, private nonprofit schools, public schools, faith-based and religious organizations, local and state governments, tribal governments, and rural electric co-ops. What that means is that for organizations that previously could not have taken direct advantage of the tax credit, they had to set up arrangements with financiers, third-party ownership arrangements, that if they want to finance their solar, they can in fact get a direct payment from the government upfront for that tax credit, the equivalent of it, which is a pretty big change in the policy that takes place. So that starts in 2033, and we're eager to see what that shakes out as in the marketplace, what offerings are available for those entities, and what comes from that. But that's a pretty big change we supported as part of our campaign, our 30 million solar homes campaign, and that is in the bill, that is in the law, which is wonderful. And then this last note here, just on the residential side, is that one of the things that used to be have to be paired with solar is for battery storage. So previous to this regulation, this law, that if you wanted to install batteries, it had to be paired with solar, and you had to demonstrate that those batteries were charged 100% from the solar source to get the tax credit. That's still available for solar plus storage. But now you can also install storage by itself and get that 30% tax credit. There's a separate provision for that, which is pretty great. And you'll see that being used, I think, more and more as well, not only for retrofits for homes that already have solar, but also probably for new home construction where batteries may be part of what's included in the standard package of resources that are in a home. There's a whole separate part of this conversation that we don't have time for today about aggregating those batteries and other things into resources that can be used to help increase adoption to the grid. But that's a pretty significant piece of the bill that we're excited to see. Next slide, Annie. One of the other parts of this, and before I actually start here, you'll see this picture, little personal note. This is actually a community solar array on the Cedar Ridge Community Church in Montgomery County, Maryland. I had the pleasure of visiting recently, and we helped a little bit kind of get off the ground. And that is a community solar facility, about 2 megawatts of production. That's part of that state program. And it's you can see there's some beehives there. It's going to have some pollinator habitat included. We hope that some of the provisions of this bill really continue to supercharge that community solar market and others across the country. So I'm going to be talking about a lot of details about this right now. In the bill, I have not purposely put a lot of that content on the slides so that it's not overwhelming, but I'm going to talk through some pieces of it that are really important drivers for those community scale projects. And rest assured, we'll have information on our website as well. There's a bunch of pages, Annie, at some point we'll put those in the chat that explain this a little bit more, and also make some references to other places you can read more about that information. So up front, you can see we've got tax credits that are going to be available. The existing commercial credit was already in place, what they call the ITC, or the investment tax credit. That's been pushed back up to 30%. There's also a production tax credit, which we're not going to get into too much here, that's available for commercial projects. But most importantly for the conversation here is that those projects, when they're below a certain scale, under 1 megawatt AC, just for rough purposes, that's a relatively small community shared facility, certainly much smaller than you'd see a utility scale or really large. Project like that, just for reference, might take up maybe 5 acres of land, 1 megawatt. So projects that are on the small side for community scale, there's going to be some adders or percentage adders that you can get up front for those projects in certain situations. And I'm going to talk through a couple of those right now for you. So 30%, that's the starting point. You can also have an additional 10% on there for projects that are located in what they call energy communities. And those energy communities, there's a definition in the bill, but it's essentially abandoned mine lands, former fossil fuel plant sites, and some other similar types of locations. If the project is sited there, they can get an additional 10% on that tax credit. Also 10%, a separate 10% for projects with significant domestic content for the equipment that's in there. And there's some very specific language about the percentages of domestic content. That's equipment like the panels, the inverters, what they call the balance of system, all the materials they use, the racking to install those systems when they come from domestic sources at a certain percentage that's defined in that legislation. An additional 10% is going to be available. And that speaks a little bit more to Glenn's point about this being really industrial policy, is that the bill is crafted from a variety of different angles to increase manufacturing in the United States, as well as the demand, which is building projects, which is really important. So that's an additional 10%. So now we're at 50% for projects that are small scale, that are taking that 30% tax credit. The projects that are maybe located in an energy community, that's 40%. Projects with domestic content, that's 50%. So that's sizable. On top of that, there are also some provisions that provide additional percentages that are in what they call like application-based part of the process. Those rules for applying haven't been defined yet, but for projects that are cited in low-income communities, defined by what they call the new markets tax credit, or on Indian tribal land, those are going to be qualifying for 10% if they get pre-approved by Department of Treasury. And if you have a project that's on that land and it is benefiting qualified low-income residential building, or the output, like subscribing to community solar, their shared solar projects, if a percentage of that output over 50% is benefiting income qualified residents in that community, then that's 20%. So now suddenly, if you get approved for that percentage and those other percentages, you could have a project that in theory is up to 70% qualified. Now there's a lot of requirements to get to that, but those are the types of things that the bill is trying to encourage. And those are for, as I said, small scale projects under 1 megawatt AC, projects under 5 megawatts. So that's a little bit bigger, but still in the community scale solar. Projects under 5 megawatts can also take advantage of those if they meet certain labor requirements. And those are defined in the bill as well. You'll see some references on our website to those requirements. There's a lot of this stuff has not been fully defined yet. And I think the last point I'll make here is that the IRS has to write some of these rules, right? So some of these things we don't know in detail about how they'll be implemented. Generally speaking, I think we can expect to see more clarity in the next 4 to 6 months on that. And the labor requirements, from what we understand, are the ones that are probably going to get worked out first because of the importance to the significance of that to labor unions. And they've been pushing on this and others to really get those defined. So we'll start to have more information about that as time goes on. But just wanted to give you kind of a snapshot of the types of things that are in this bill to improve not only the expansion of solar, but also to really focus it on topics around energy justice and making sure that projects are available and benefiting frontline and disadvantaged communities. So I've stopped there. I'm sure y'all have tons of questions. We do too. And I will turn it back over to Glenn and to Annie for the next set here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Corey. And we have lots and lots of questions, and luckily a lot of them we'll be able to answer very briefly, but a lot of them will require a little more. But before we get to the questions on the material that Corey presented, I wanted to turn it over to my colleague Emma Searson, who will talk about other related aspects of the bill, particularly the electrification and energy efficiency provisions. Emma?
Great. Thank you so much, Glenn. Hope folks can hear me okay. And thank you all for being here. As Glenn mentioned, I want to start by talking through some of the top highlights in the bill for energy efficiency and for electrification. Before getting into the details on those highlights, though, I do want to just briefly touch on why these particular opportunities are so important and important to an organization like Solar United Neighbors that mostly focuses on solar. So making our homes and businesses more efficient it's just one of the best and easiest and most affordable ways to save money on energy bills while at the same time reducing overall energy demand and stress on the power grid, the costs of that stress, and of course, pollution. And on top of that, transitioning to efficient electric technologies like heat pumps and electric vehicles can help amplify those benefits even more. And all of these electric and efficiency tools are really great complements to rooftop solar. They enable solar panels on your home, if you have them, to power even more of the things that you use every day in your home or your business. So with that in mind, we can head to the next slide. And I'll cover what exactly is in the IRA that will advance efficient and electric technologies. So Annie, if you can just go to the next slide. For one, the IRA increases, extends, and expands tax credits for geothermal heat pumps, for electric heat pumps, and for electrical upgrades that are sometimes necessary to actually adopt those technologies at home, like replacing your electric panel board. The bill also provides funding for 2 sets of rebates that will be administered at the state level. And it's important to note here that these are rebates. So rather than being a discount off your taxes, they're more of a direct payment or a direct discount. The first of these 2 rebate programs is $4.3 billion that will go through state energy offices to provide rebates for energy efficiency upgrades that help homes and also multifamily buildings save more energy under the Homeowner Managing Energy Savings, or HOMES, rebate program. Those rebates are going to encourage things like better insulation and windows and more efficient heating and cooling that just helps households save energy. And then the second of these rebate programs is a combined $4.5 billion that will go to state energy offices and also to tribes to establish rebate programs for home electrification. This will be under a high efficiency electric homes rebate program. And these will encourage electric technologies like heat pumps and electric stoves. And then the last incentive on the slide from the IRA is that it establishes new tax credits and also extends existing tax credits for the purchase of new and used electric vehicles. So those tax credits are up to $7,500 for a new EV and $4,000 for a used EV. The exact amount depends on personal income and also on the cost of the vehicle and where certain parts in that vehicle were manufactured. So there is some complexity there. And one note on all of these programs is that they are going to help drive down the cost of transitioning to efficient and electric technologies. And that's important because it'll make it possible for more families to take advantage of those tools and see real savings. I will just lastly note on this slide that with the exception of tax credits for geothermal heat pumps and tax credits for new EVs, those 2 were previously existing and have been extended. But the rest of these tax credits are new, and that means that they will be available starting next year in 2023 rather than this year. Okay, so moving right along to the next slide, the last category of highlights that we want to cover on this webinar are opportunities in the IRA for solar equity and for energy justice. There are, thankfully, a number of provisions in this bill that are specifically aimed at helping address longstanding inequities in the impacts, both positive and negative, of our energy system. So I'll talk through those in a little bit of detail. On the next slide, one of the provisions that is definitely worth highlighting is a total of $3 billion in environmental and climate justice block grants. those will fund environmental justice projects, specifically for disadvantaged communities. The funding will be available to states, tribes, municipalities, and nonprofits, and it could be used to fund programs like community-led air pollution monitoring and remediation, or investments in low and no emission technologies, or mitigating climate and health risks from urban heat islands, and plenty of other interesting opportunities along those lines. I also want to note here that those adders or additional credits that can be earned on top of the non-residential ITC, which Corey went over earlier, will be important for incentivizing solar projects that directly benefit disadvantaged communities. As Corey explained, that's going to include communities that have been directly and disproportionately affected by fossil fuels, which we're terming energy communities in this bill. Also low-income communities and communities on tribal lands. On the next slide, I want to highlight that the bill also earmarks additional and long-term funding that will be really helpful in supporting rural communities in their energy transition. So on that list, the bill includes $1 billion with a B for the Rural Energy for America program, or REAP. That program, if you're not familiar, helps rural businesses and farms adopt clean and efficient technologies, including solar, through both grants and loans. So this big influx of funding over the next 10 years will help REAP actually reach more farms and businesses. And it's also going to bump up the maximum grant amount that they can receive. That grant amount used to be capped at 25% of a project's total cost, and now that cap is getting bumped up to 50% of a project's total cost. The IRA also allocated another $1 billion for rural renewable energy electrification loans. Those will be available to utilities that serve customers in rural areas. And it included almost $10 billion for loans and financing for rural electric co-ops to help them invest in more clean and renewable energy. And then the very last thing I want to highlight here is the creation of a $27 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund, which will be a national green bank. So the idea behind a national green bank is to bring in even more private capital to fund green energy projects. Some estimate that this funding could lead to 10 times as much private lending for community solar, efficiency, and other projects that will benefit underserved communities. So I know that was a lot to cover. I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Glenn.
That's great, Emma. And as you can see, the bill is, complicated, right? There's lots and lots of parts to it, and lots and lots of things that are within reach for lots of people. So that's why, there's so many people on this call, and that's why we're getting lots of inquiries about it. So I've been looking at the questions, and there is a whole bunch about the availability of the solar investment tax credit for nonprofits. And so I was going to ask Corey to unpack that a little more. The kinds of questions, Corey, if you followed it in Q&A, is when does it become available? What is direct pay? Which is a term of art, so that's a really good question. And then I'll comb through a few others, but I'm thinking maybe if you would just take a moment to walk us more thoroughly through that provision for tax-exempt organizations.
Yep. Yeah, I'd be happy to. First off, although it sounds a little strange, it's important to remember that when you're looking at how people are talking about the bill, that nonprofit installations are technically commercial installations with respect to the tax code. So not the residential version of the code, but the commercial provisions. The direct pay piece, which is the part that actually lets nonprofits take advantage of those pieces and get paid directly, as opposed to working with a third party that owns a system and uses those credits. That provision, direct pay, it will not start until 2023. We don't know how that process will work yet because the IRS hasn't defined it. But at a high level sketch, you could expect that during the development process for a nonprofit, let's say they're putting it on their roof, or maybe they've got some space on the ground somewhere, as that process unfolds and working with a developer to spec out, design, and build that project, there will probably be a parallel process with the IRS to provide that information and to get approval for direct pay so that they have some certainty that they can proceed with that project. How that timing works, what the process is, all of that, completely not yet defined. So if anybody is familiar with other direct pay versions that the IRS conducts, I would imagine it would be similar, but we just don't know yet. So we'll be finding out hopefully very soon. And when we do, that's something that I know a lot of people have interest in, and we're going to be trying to understand that very closely so we can help folks navigate that as well, because you can see lots of interest, and rightly so.
One question we had about this was a definition of tax-exempt organizations. And I know we have a little list there, but we're getting questions about, does that include local governments? Does that include faith institutions? Does that, I guess another way to put this is, what does it include?
Yeah, there's some very specific language in the bill about any organization that is exempt from a particular type of taxes. The short answer is that yes, it includes nonprofits and governments and municipalities and faith-based organizations, all of those. I would actually, as far as the reference of like the type of tax exempt, I'll have to actually punt that to maybe Emma, if you know, there's a specific term that's in the bill that they talk about, but the general answer is just about every tax exempt organization is going to be eligible.
Yeah, that includes rural electric co-ops too, which is a form of a nonprofit.
And organizations in Puerto Rico, which is pretty huge.
For the first time. And so I just got another question about direct pay. I think someone wants a definition and how it is distinguish direct pay from tax credit. So Corey, maybe you could restate that.
Yes, yeah. So with a tax credit, any tax credit, you are taking with related to solar, you're taking the installed cost of the system, applying that percentage, 30%, and you are filing a form on your tax filing or your tax report that essentially provides that as a deduction. Sorry, not a deduction, a credit off of your tax bill. So if you owe $10,000 and you have a $3,000 credit, you now owe $7,000. So you have to have tax liability to use it. Nonprofits don't have tax liability at the federal government, so direct pay is a way to compensate for that, where you don't have that credit available. Instead, you're actually getting a cash payment from the government that represents the value of what that credit would have been. So that $3,000 in my example would go directly to you and thereby to your solar developer to offset the cost of the system, or to your finance organization. If you're financing the array, that might go towards paying part of your loan. So the difference is when you file it and where you get the value, either off of your credit of your tax bill, which is the regular tax credit, or a direct payment that comes to you from the IRS, which is for the nonprofit and all the other organizations we mentioned as part of direct pay.
Thanks, Corey. Here's another question about this. I think it happened because you may have said the wrong date, and so a lot of people typed in. I didn't actually hear it, but the start date for the direct pay for nonprofits is 2023.
2023, yes. So sorry if I said something different. It starts in 2023.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that everyone heard that because we've got a lot of questions. Here's an interesting question. It says some of these incentives are tax credits and some are rebates. That is, of course, a little confusing. And so this question is, how will the rebates be administered? Tax credits, of course, this is IRS. That's pretty clear to most people. But what about the rebates?
I could take this one. So I think that's mostly relevant to the efficiency and electrification rebates. Both of these programs are going to be administered at the state or tribal level. So funding, the dollar amounts, the billions I mentioned, will come from the federal government, will flow through states and tribal governments, but the rebates themselves will be targeted towards consumers. We don't have every single detail about how those are going to work, but we do know that for the most part, they'll be available starting in 2023 to fund the variety of electrification and efficiency topics I mentioned. And much like Corey was describing for direct pay, a rebate means it's not going to be a discount on your taxes, but will be more of a direct payment, or in some cases, a point of sale discount. So a upfront discount off the price of the thing that you're investing in and installing.
Basically a coupon.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Here's a question that we get a lot that it hasn't really changed the rules, but it's a good question. Question is, and this is for Corey, with increasing tax credits, meaning from the 26 to the 30%, I believe. If you can't use your credit all in the year you install the solar, can you roll it into the next year? And there were a number of questions about the how many years you can roll forward. So we're not accountants, but Corey?
Yeah, thank you. And to our knowledge, that those rules have not changed. Previously, if you can't use all that tax credit in 1 year based on your existing tax liability for a given tax year, you can break that up and use it until it's consumed. As always with that stuff, we recommend just checking with your tax provider, but generally speaking, you should be able to use it over several years to use that up.
Here's another quick question about solar systems installed in 2022, which of course, at the time they installed, the ITC was at 26%, and now it's going to 30%. So if you could just clarify again, is it possible? The questions are basically, is it possible to get that 4%?
Yes. If your system is going to be placed in service this year, which is the term of art or language from the IRS, then your system will be eligible for 30% tax credit instead of the 26 you were expecting. So congratulations, you got 4 more %, which is, that's great. And that is true for the residential tax credit and for the commercial version of the credit.
And it's will not be true for the nonprofit direct pay ITC, just to,
Correct.
because I'm seeing
yes.
these questions again.
Yep.
Okay, so let me, there's a lot of these questions. This is an interesting question. Does Sun partner with or have any plans to partner with retail energy providers? And this is a question about Texas specifically. So this is not really about the IRA, but I thought I'd still take it because it's a important question, and there's actually 2 of these. So Emma, I think you might be able to address that quickly.
Sorry, Glenn, I didn't catch the whole question. Would you just repeat it?
The question is, do we have any, are we partnering with retail energy providers in Texas? Because Texas has very little in the way of rules that help people like net metering. So
yeah, that's a really fun question. Thank you for whoever asked that. Yeah, we are, our Texas folks have been working to basically build up a group of homeowners who are interested in plans that would, offer reasonable and fair credits for the solar that they're producing and sharing with their neighbors. And what we're hoping to do is recruit their utility to offer some plans that would be appealing to those folks, something that would, be a little bit closer to a one-to-one payment for the electricity that they share. So that's in process. We don't have a final answer on, what those plans might look like and what switching would look like. But if you are interested, if you're in Texas and you're interested, you've got solar and want to get fair credits for it, then I'm sure we can pull up the link to the pledge that you can add your name to, and that would be how you join this effort.
great.
Glenn, one more thing on the Texas thing. In addition to everything that Emma just shared, we do have a service that helps people figure out what retail plan maximizes their solar savings. It's something that we partnered with a service provider on about 1.5 years ago. It's a free report. If anybody's in Texas, especially in Encore and Centerpoint territories, and you're just trying to figure out which plan is the best one for your solar array, we can generate a custom report for you to tell you all the plans and what their expected savings will be annually. So feel free to head to the Texas version part of our website, and you can find a link there. And if you can't find it, just email us at txteam@solarunitedneighbors.org, and we can help you locate that report.
Yeah. Here's a really good question, and it brings up a sore subject for us, really, because as I said, the bill wasn't perfect, and we tried to get a direct pay option for the ITC for people who don't make enough money really to have a tax liability, right? That's simply not fair to be excluded in that way. And unfortunately, it was in the House bill, a direct pay option for residential, but it was taken out in the Senate version, which became the law. So that's the bad news there. The question was, what do I do? Well, the question is, you continue to be excluded from the use of the the ITC for a residential project. And we're going to keep working on that. That's the, that's a matter of simple fairness and equity. And it's a shame that was taken out, but that's what happened. Of course, the option for people who want to take advantage of other credits is to pursue a community solar project, and perhaps one that could be enhanced by and financed by, in part, the IRA. This is an interesting question about the adders. And so, Corey, I think this is a question for you. There's this term of art again, an adder. Maybe you can explain what the adders are about. This is really on the production side, and but I think it's a question you both hear over. So maybe you could unpack that.
Yep. So the bill, and this I think is true for in a couple different contexts for legislation like this, is that the both at the state and the federal level is that there are sometimes additional benefits that are defined for projects that meet a certain criteria that the legislators want to encourage. In this case, those criteria are around communities that have historically been excluded from the benefits of renewable energy development and have been impacted by fossil fuel production, or in the case of energy communities, which is one of those adders, are transitioning away from fossil fuel production, trying to support those communities and create economic wealth locally there in the form of job creation and energy savings for residents. So based on that desire, the baseline investment tax credit, which is a percentage of the installed system cost, we're talking about the commercial credit here, those adders then just plus up or spruce up that value in increments based on what criteria you meet. So that, for example, if you have a solar array that's located in a defined abandoned mine area in a, let's say, in a historic community that is a fossil fuel community, that project would be eligible for both the base 30% investment tax credit and an additional 10%. So 40% of the installed system cost would be eligible for those credits on the tax bill of whoever owned that system. And all of those adders work in a similar way. There's a definition of who's eligible. And if you meet that definition, you can claim that additional benefit based on those requirements.
Great. A related question here is, can munis or other tax-exempt entities access the adders?
I believe so, as long as they fit the sizing requirements I mentioned. So under 1 megawatt for any systems, and under 5 megawatts for systems that meet those labor standards that I mentioned in my presentation.
Got it. There's people are asking about this question of transferability of tax credit, which is another one of these words that it's not apparent what it is. So maybe you could talk about, Corey, that concept of transferability and how it relates to the provisions of the IRA we've been talking about.
Yes, I will do my best, since transferability is sort of a new thing for us too. My understanding of the bill is that the not for nonprofits, but for businesses or commercial entities who are developing projects and wish to transfer the value of their credit to another business. So let's say, for example, it doesn't work for their tax situation for whatever reason. They can, and the way that I think it's defined in the bill is that they can transfer that credit to be used by another entity in exchange for a cash payment. So you might find that, for example, small commercial businesses, I'm just making up an example, but small commercial solar installation, it's possible that solar companies will say, transfer the credit to us. We have somebody who can use it, and in exchange, we'll give you, a better financing deal to pay for the solar that's on the roof of your factory or your, light manufacturing plant. So that concept of transferability is being able to give the thing that you qualified for, that tax credit value, to another entity that also has tax liability, so they can use it instead. And again, just to confirm, my understanding is that that's not available for nonprofits, but they have direct pay, but it is from one commercial entity to another. So that's an area that we frankly need more understanding from the IRS, but that's the general concept.
Great. Thanks, Corey. That is a confusing bit of part of this. Emma, here's two questions for you. Are the electrification tax credits also available to nonprofits? like municipalities and school districts?
Yeah, that's a good question. To my knowledge, the rebates for electrification and efficiency are specifically for homes, so for both single family and multi-family homes.
We have a related question, which is really the same question. What about the heat pump rebate in nonprofits?
Right, the heat pump rebate is part of, if we're talking about those rebate programs, then the same will be true, that those are geared towards homes, multifamily, and single.
Yeah, okay. Here are two more, I'm trying to group questions together. When do we expect states to release details on the home efficiency rebates? That's the first question for Emma. And I think you might want to just take this one too, Emma. Is there a federal timeline for state energy offices to roll these programs out?
Yes, very good questions. So I believe that both of the rebate programs will be in effect starting in 2023. So, we will need some clarifications for what exactly they'll look like, how folks can apply, all of that stuff. And we'd be expecting that between now and then. And then there are specified timelines for when that funding will be available and when it needs to be spent, essentially. I don't have all of those in front of me, but I'll pull up some links and drop them in the chat real quick. There are a lot of details there.
Okay. Here's a quick one, which is, I have a feeling this is bad news for the questioner. This person just bought an induction stove. And so the question, of course, is, am I out of luck for any rebate?
Yeah, my understanding is that they're going to start in 2023, since these are new rebate programs. And, as with the case with a lot of the tax incentives that Corey talked through, if they're new and unprecedented, then they'll generally speaking start in 2023. Whereas if they're just extensions of existing credits, then they're in effect now. So unfortunately, I think you might be.
Yeah. This is a question, I guess, Emmy, for you, the EV
Sure.
credits. And this is a very good question. Do plug-in hybrids vehicles, are they eligible? Is it only full EVs?
Great question. I am pulling up, and I'm gonna pop
I
this
don't know
link
the
in
answer
the.
to that.
Yeah, I can't say that I do off the top of my head either, but I just put in the chat a really helpful resource about which kinds of vehicles we think will qualify for these rebates. And I'll share a couple of additional resources from the Electrification Coalition. And I'll just say, in general, the electric vehicle tax credits are complex. There are lots of different new requirements on where they're manufactured and all of that. And we at Sun are less electric vehicle experts than we are solar experts. So I would highly recommend these Electrification Coalition resources in terms of figuring out, what sort of cars might actually qualify there.
Yes. This is not so much a question, but a comment, but it's so related. I want to convey it to everybody. It says, have you reviewed the Rewire America's calculator? We actually have, and it's going to be in a link in the fact sheet that we'll be sending out to everybody. But they have a very handy calculator, so you can put in what you want to do and what the financial benefit, the cost benefit in effect. So we have reviewed it. It is very good. To get a baseline. Real quick question, to include replacement, the home efficiency rebate program include replacement of windows, and what's the amount?
Yeah, the first of the two rebate programs, the one that's focused on efficiency rather than electrification, does include things like windows that are better for insulation, as well as additional insulation itself. And one of the other, I think, examples that comes to mind is HVAC or heating and cooling upgrades that will be more efficient. So all of those kind of things that lead to really big energy savings for a household.
Yeah. Corey, we have a number of questions about community solar, and so I think the gist of, there's so many separate ones, but I think the gist of the questions are, what has changed? What are the benefits of the opportunities of the IRA that would make community solar easier, cheaper, etc. So they're sort of, maybe you could run through that whole piece of it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, if you hear the things that we send out, you can probably tell we're big fans of community solar. It's a really important part of addressing equity of access to solar. So we certainly care about this issue and this question quite a bit. All of the adders that I described, even though they're available broadly, the system sizes like 5 megawatts AC, for example, is a very common max system size for community solar regulations in various states. Like New Jersey, for example, has a community solar program. Their system size max, I think, is 5 megawatts. So they're sort of crafted to encourage siting and development of those projects, specifically with that energy justice framework in mind. Now, what that means practically is that developers seeking access to those additional credit adders should, in theory, be able to expand the number of projects and the demand for those projects, hopefully correspondingly, across all programs where there's community solar development. So if you have a state program, we would expect that the developers working in that state would be incentivized to produce more of those types of projects. So just to give you, an example, if they're able to get access to the 20%, approval by approval adder for projects that benefit income qualified residents, and that's a market that they're interested in going after, they're going to probably be pretty motivated to do that. That means more projects that are focused on access for income qualified residents, and hopefully means more savings that's going to flow to those residents and to those communities. So it's a little uncertain like how and what that looks like, but the legislation is pretty clearly designed to encourage that development and to really push the industry to work in those areas. So that's it's really wonderful, and we're eager to see how that all plays out.
Next question, there are two related questions about the Rural Energy for America program, which gives solar and energy efficiency grants to rural businesses and farms all over the country. So the questions are, and I think, Emma, you're probably the right one to answer this, or maybe our colleague Liz, who's helping to answer questions. It says, do we know when the 50% match for REAP is the acronym for the program, kick in? Does it start this fall, or we have to wait till 2023?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I was actually just hunting for the answer, and either I don't know it yet or we all don't know it yet. I can dig a little bit more, but there, a lot of these really technical questions about how exactly is this going to work are kind of pending clarification. And I think that might fit into that bucket.
Yeah. Here's a good question. It's unfortunately easy to answer. Is there anything in the bill that incentivizes utilities to support net metering? And I think the answer is no. Corey, I think that's what you would say too.
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah.
Something we had hoped to get in the bill, but did not. Here's just a quick question, because we use the word ITC a lot, but people do see the word PTC a lot, which refers to the production tax credit. And even though that's not the focus of this webinar, Corey, maybe you could explain that.
Yep, I'm happy to do that. So we're not super familiar with the production tax credit because up until this bill, it was not available for solar. It hasn't been for a while. It's typically available for the wind energy, but it is, instead of an upfront percentage that comes back to the system owner, it is a credit that is delivered over time based on like predefined values per kilowatt hour. So by production tax credit, it is tied to the electricity production of the facility. And depending on where that facility is, like a project in the Southwest, for example, where they may be getting a lot of kilowatt hours per panel versus the Northeast, they might choose different credits or tax credits to use, whether it's the ITC, the upfront one, or the PTC, the production tax credit. And those are up to the developers based on the rules and their parameters for their projects. But the short is the PTC, or production tax credit, is something that it gets paid out over time based on the energy production of the system.
Thank you. I did refer to the lack of a direct pay option for the ITC for residential installations and how that was unfair. And I do want to acknowledge there's a question that evidently in the chat, a couple of questions It says, how does reimbursement work, meaning direct pay for retirees only on Social Security that have no income tax? And I think you've put your finger on part of the inequity of the ITC. And that's a problem. So there's a number of questions about that. It's just not fair. There's a question about this whole domestic manufacturing component. And the one question is it just about EVs, or is it going to be about solar panels? So, Corey, what can you tell us about that?
But one of those adders that I mentioned, that 10% is for what they call domestic content. So I believe there's components for it for storage and for other things as well, but specifically in the context of solar development, it is part of that adder structure, 10% for domestic content, and the percentages are defined in the bill. I don't have them in front of me, but it's clear. It should be clear that that content has to be a certain percentage of the total equipment used to be able to qualify.
Got it. And here's a question. Number one, do EV chargers qualify? Is there a rebate or incentive for EV chargers? That is both the purchase and installation, which is a good specific question. And then there's another question: is how are people going to find out what specific products qualify of energy efficiency products? You know, would it be this particular tankless water heater? Would it be, how are people going to find out?
Sure. Okay, so starting on the EV chargers, the IRA does extend the federal tax credit on charging equipment through 2032. So for individual or residential charging, that the percentage credit is unchanged. It's 30%, but there is the $1,000 cap. For commercial charging equipment, the credit's 6%, and there's a cap on that as well, like per property that I don't have in front of me. And those commercial credits can only be for low income communities or non-urban areas. But long story short, yes, there is a tax credit for charging equipment as well. And then Glenn, remind me the second question. Hard to answer two at once.
I'm going to have to cut us off because we're
perfect.
coming to the end. We have over 200 questions, plus more in the chat. And of course, we did our best to get to as many as possible. This is not the end of a conversation, of course. We'll be, I want to wrap things up and tell you what's going to happen next. So thanks, Corey, and Emma, for your expertise. So again, we'll send out follow-up resources to everyone who registered for the webinar, and you can always contact us with specific questions by sending an email to advocacy@solarunitedneighbors.org. And if my team can't help, then we'll talk to Corey's team. I do want to suggest a few next steps for everybody. Obviously, we're here to encourage you to take advantage of the IRA's numerous opportunities to install a rooftop solar system or join a community solar project, etc. Check out information on Sun's website about joining one or more of our solar co-ops, which are there to help people overcome the various hurdles. If you've already gone solar, consider adding a battery, right? Because you can add that and get the tax credit. You might want to think about starting to plan your upgrade, your efficiency upgrade of your household or business and take advantage of more of these savings. I know I'm thinking about it, maybe you too, about making my next car or your next car an electric powered one. I haven't been able to do it yet. If you're connected to a local nonprofit organization, please suggest they take advantage of this new tax credit. If you live in a rural area, tell a local business or farmer about the REAP Solar Grant Program. The funding has quadrupled. Of course, that will mean more competition for grants, but more grants. And finally, please share this information with your family members and your neighbors and coworkers. We at Sun are really excited about helping and bringing together more people to go solar. And thanks again so much for your time, and have a great afternoon. We'll continue this conversation. Thanks so much.